Hello there, good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to our webinar all about maternity pay in Sage 50 Payroll. My name's Duncan, I'll be hosting and presenting the webinar, and I am joined this afternoon by my colleagues Alice and Lee, who are both standing by in the background, ready and waiting to answer your questions. Let's now take a look at what we'll cover in the webinar. So we'll start with an introduction to statutory maternity pay, running through some of the key legislation and the qualifying conditions. And we'll also talk about reclaiming statutory payments and what makes you eligible for small employers relief. We'll then give you some practical demos on recording maternity details. So I will show you two places you can record the details in Payroll and how to check the amount of SMP that will be calculated. And then we'll look in the pay run at how to adjust your employees' payments, either using the Make Up Basic option if you have a company maternity scheme and you're topping up to full basic, or by entering your own manual adjustments. We're then going to finish with the month-end process, which is when you reclaim your statutory parental payments. So I'll show you where it appears on a P32 report and how to submit your employer payment summary, or EPS. And we'll finish with 5 minutes on troubleshooting, running through some of the more common queries that we get on SMP and some top tips to help avoid those issues. So let's get started with our introduction to SMP. So first of all, what does SMP stand for? Well, it's short for Statutory Maternity Pay. And this is the minimum amount that you need to pay to qualifying employees when they're taking time off work and they've had a baby. Now, SMP is paid at two different rates. So for the first 6 weeks of entitlement, the employee gets the higher rate of SMP, and this is 90% of that employee's average weekly earnings, or AWE. And then for the remainder of the paid maternity leave, 33 weeks, they would get at the standard rate. So that's a flat rate of £187.18 per week for the current tax year, or 90% of AWE if that's lower. So for lower paid employees, the 90% of average earnings is the rate throughout the maternity leave. For most, 90% of average is the higher rate, and then they get that flat rate as the standard rate for those 33 weeks. Now, in order to qualify for this payment, the employee must meet the eligibility requirements. So I've listed these on screen, and you can read more about these on the gov.uk website. But just to run through them now, employees must be on your payroll in the qualifying week. Now, this is the 15th week before the expected week of childbirth. They need to give you the correct notice. So 15 weeks notice of their intention to take maternity leave and SMP, and 28 days notice of the date that they want to start their SMP. They need to provide proof that they're pregnant, which is usually the MAP B1 certificate that they get from the doctor or midwife. And they need to have been continuously employed by you for at least 26 weeks up to any day within the qualifying week. The average earnings must be at least £125 per week in the 8-week relevant period, and that is the period that leads up to the qualifying week. That £125 is the lower earnings limit for national insurance. So just to visualize some of these key dates on a timeline, we're going to count back from the due date, or expected week of confinement, EWC. And if we count back 15 weeks from that date, we get to the qualifying week. And then counting back another 26 weeks, we get to the employee's latest start date to meet that continuous employment condition. So they must be employed at least 26 weeks before the qualifying week. The 8-week set period is the period that leads up to the qualifying week. And this is where your employee's average weekly earnings will be calculated to check that they, first of all, qualify for the payment, but also to establish the higher rate of SMP, which is 90% of that average. And then a couple of other dates to be aware of. 11 weeks before the due date is the earliest date that maternity leave can begin, unless the baby is born before that date. in which case SMP will begin the day after the date of birth. And then 4 weeks before the due date is when an employee who is off sick with a pregnancy-related sickness must transfer to SMP, even if they had originally planned to start their SMP later than that. So they transfer from SSP to SMP if they have a pregnancy-related sickness 4 weeks before the due date. So you'll see where you can check these dates when we go through the demonstration. But before we go into the demo, I'd just like to talk briefly about reclaiming statutory payments. Now, any statutory parental payment can be reclaimed from HMRC, and most employers would reclaim 92% of the statutory parental pay. However, some employers would qualify for small employers relief, in which case you would be eligible to reclaim 108.5% of the SMP paid. So it's 100% of SMP and 8.5% known as NI compensation. Now, you'd usually qualify for small employers relief if your total Class 1 national insurance contributions are £45,000 or less in the tax year prior to the qualifying or matching week in the case of adoption. And if you qualify for small employers relief, it is important that you set this up in Sage Payroll before you process the statutory payment, as that will ensure that the correct amount is reclaimed at the end of the month. So you'd get the small employers percentage rather than the standard 92%. So let's have a quick look now at how you can check if you're eligible for small employers relief and where to set that up. So I'm just going to bring the slides down. We're just going to jump into Sage Payroll. So first of all, I'm going to show you an easy way to check your total Class 1 national insurance contributions in a previous tax year. So the easiest way to do this is to first change your process date to the last day of the tax year that you want to check. So I'm going to change mine to the 5th of April 2025. So that's the last day of the 24 to 25 tax year. And then you can run the P32 report, but instead of running it for a single month, as you would normally do at the end of the month, you would run it for the full year, so tax month 1 to 12. Now, if you're on your payroll tasks, if you look within this links section, there is a shortcut to the P32 report. So I'm going to run it from here. And when the criteria values pop up, instead of running it just for month 12, I'm going to change the criteria value, so I'm running it from month 1 to month 12, so for the full year. And if I click OK, that's going to show you the P32 report for the tax year ending 5th of April 2025. And the figure that we need to check is the gross national insurance. This is your total Class 1 national insurance contributions, employees plus employers. And if this figure was £45,000 or less, you'd usually qualify for the small employers relief. So in my case, I do qualify for SER, small employers relief. So what I need to do before I process a statutory parental payment is you just set your process date back into the current tax year. I'm going to set mine to my next pay date. And then if you go to company and settings, on the settings tab, or on the details tab, you've got a tick box on the right hand side, just at the top here, that you would need to tick if you're eligible for small employers relief. So I already did this check at the start of the tax year, and I've already been in and ticked this box. And this means that when I process a statutory parental payment, I'll be reclaiming that 108.5% rather than the standard 92%. Now, if you don't qualify, you should just double check that this box is not ticked. And you'll see a little bit later on in the demo how you reclaim your statutory payments, which is all done as part of the month-end process. So what we're going to take a look at next is setting up SMP in Sage 50 Payroll, and this will just involve recording the relevant maternity details. And the information you'll need in order to complete this task is, number one, the date the employee wants to start their maternity leave and their SMP payments. And number two, you need to make sure you've received the medical evidence, usually the MAP-B1 certificate, which confirms the baby's due date. And as long as you've got that, you've got everything that you need to set this up in your program. So I'm going to show you how to do this now in the demo. I'm going to show you a couple of ways, a couple of places you can record the maternity details. So let's just bring the slides down once again. I'm going to return to my payroll tasks. And the first method I want to show you is the quick SMP screen. And this is where you can enter all of the maternity details in one place. And it also gives you the option of running a handy report that will summarize the key dates and the SMP entitlement. So first thing we'll do is to select the employee who's going on maternity leave. So it happens to be employee 1 in my list. And then to get into the quick SMP screen, if you're on the payroll tasks, just look for a link that says recording maternity. So you can see it just here. Or if you can't see the links pane, it might be that it needs resizing. So you can do that by kind of dragging this handle up and down. Or alternatively, just go to the employee tasks and you'll find the recording maternity option from here. So you'll only see these options active if you've got an individual employee selected. So when I go into recording maternity, you can see it's taken us into the quick SMP screen. So usually this would be kind of blank to start with. So it would look something like this. And what you would need to do is to select the medical evidence received box to confirm you've received the MAP-B1 certificate. And then from that medical evidence, you can then enter the expected date of birth. So in this example, the due date, expected date of birth is the 26th of July. So I've entered that in the box here. I can then click check entitlement, and payroll will do some background checks and it will indicate if the qualifying conditions have been met. And what we're hoping to see here is 3 green ticks to say we've received the medical evidence, the employee's worked for long enough, and that they earn enough to receive SMP. Now, the only other thing we need to enter at this point is the employee's last day of work, and the following day will be the first day of the SMP payment. Now, a quick note here, if the employee has chosen to take some annual leave before they officially start maternity leave, you would treat the last day of that holiday, that annual leave, as the last day of work, and then SMP will be calculated from the following day. But in this particular example, the employee is actually working up until Friday the 18th, this Friday, and that will be their last day of work. So SMP payments will begin on the 19th of July. So now that we've got those 2 dates entered, you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, the SMP entitlement is being displayed. Before we look at that, just to show you what else you can see on this screen, we can see the calculated average earnings figure. So this has been calculated from the payments made in the 8-week set period. And then we've got this employee's key dates. So the due date that we entered, 15th week before the baby's due. So this is the qualifying week, in this case, the 6th of April. The latest start date to meet the continuous employment condition, 19th of October. So they were employed before then. This was the set period where the average earnings was calculated. 11 weeks before the due date, 4th of May. And if they were off sick with a pregnancy-related illness, they will have moved on to SMP early on the 22nd of June. Last day of work we entered, and then the last day of the paid maternity leave. So the end of that 39 weeks, it's going to be the 17th of April, 2026. Now, when you have the information, you can come back to fill in the actual date of birth and the employee's return to work date. And if that's before the end of the 39 weeks, that will reduce the entitlement as required. And then we've got areas here where you can record special circumstances. So it's not very often you need to use this, but this is where you would record the number of weeks on trade dispute if an employee has been on strike, for example, as this will affect the length of service according to the rules. You've got a tick box that can be selected if the maternity pay started early due to sickness, 4 weeks before the due date. And then there's this tick box if the maternity leave needs to start earlier than 11 weeks due to the birth of the child. You would just come in and you would select this box. So most of the time you won't need to fill this in. That's where you'd find it. And then finally, the earnings during set period. This is where you can see how the average earnings have been calculated. So pretty simple in this case. They get the same pay each month. So these were the payments made in the 8-week period. And from those 2 monthly payments, a weekly average has been calculated. Now, sometimes that will need to be overridden. For example, if there's been a pay rise awarded since that date. So if required, if you need to amend the average earnings manually, you can overtype this calculated figure. But this is where the higher rate is coming from. So 90% of this amount is what they're going to get for the first 6 weeks. So that's what we're seeing here in the entitlement. 6 weeks at higher rate, so 90% of average weekly earnings, followed by 33 weeks at the flat rate of 187.18. And because this is going to continue into the 26 to 27 tax year, that will likely increase slightly in the new tax year as the SMP rates tend to be uplifted from the 6th of April. But that will all happen automatically once your software has been updated for the year end. So one last tip, if you're using Quick SMP, is that you can print a summary of these details. So you've got this print option at the bottom, and that's going to generate a report that looks something like this. So summarizing that the qualifying conditions have been met, showing the calculated average earnings, listing the key dates, and then showing the SMP entitlement split between higher rate and standard rate. So might be a useful report to keep for your own records. It could be provided to the employee if you wanted to. So that's from the print option in the Quick SMP screen. So that's just one place you can enter the details, and personally, that's the way I would do it. So you can save these details and click on to close. Just to show you the alternative though, you can enter the same information directly in the employee record. So if I open this employee's record and go to the absence tab, at the bottom of the absence diary, you've got the SMP option. And because I've already recorded the details, you can see that they appear here. So I've got my due date, I've got the ended work date. The average earnings are shown here. But if you enter the details directly in the employee record, you will need to click the Auto Calc button to show this amount. And we've ticked the box for the medical evidence. The 8 weeks gross tab shows you how the average weekly earnings have been calculated. So that was the total payments. That's the weekly equivalent. And then the entitlement tab confirms the qualifying week and start of maternity pay period. It shows anything previously paid. So this should always show 0 at the start of the SMP. And then it's got what's currently due up to your current process date. So like all statutory payments, Sage Payroll will calculate it up to your process date, your employee's pay date. Any entitlement for future dates will be paid on a future pay date. And then we've got our full entitlement in this grid at the bottom. Now, once the maternity details are entered, one last thing I would recommend you do is to check that you can see the SMP in the enter payment screen. So returning back to my payroll tasks, I'm just going to check that I've set my next pay date, which in my example is the last day of the month, 31st of July. And if I enter payments from this point, You'll see at the moment I've got my full salary entered, and we're going to talk about adjusting that a little bit later on. But if you click the Summary tab, from the summary, this is where you'll see the calculated statutory maternity pay. So this is the total amount due up to my process date. And if you're in Enter Payments and you want to see a breakdown of that total, so you want to see how many weeks that equates to, if you click on this little drop-down arrow, that will take you into the maternity details in the employee record. And then you can jump onto the Entitlement tab. And we can see that that is 1.86 weeks. So it's 1 week and 6 days, which is the length of time between the 19th of July and the 31st of July, which is my current process date. So I'm happy with everything I'm seeing here. And we're now ready to start thinking about adjusting those payments in our next pay run. So before we go into all of that, just to recap what we've done so far. So things you'll need are the date that the employee is starting their maternity pay and the medical evidence. We use the recording maternity option or the quick SMP screen to enter the details. So enter the due date from the MAP B1 form, employee's last day of work. You can then see all of the key dates and you can check the entitlement at the bottom. Don't forget you can also print that screen as well. So it gives you a handy way of keeping a record of that information. Or the alternative is to go onto the absence tab in the employee record and click SMP. If you're doing it this way, don't forget to click Auto Calc to calculate the average earnings. And if you see existing maternity details from a previous child, you will need to do something with the year-to-date value. So I'm going to come on to that towards the end when we look at troubleshooting, but hold that thought. If there are existing details in this screen, you do need to reset some information. Last thing we did there is we went into Enter Payments just to check that the SMP is calculating. And if you want to see a breakdown of that total amount, remember from the Summary tab, select the drop-down arrow next to the SMP, and then you can check the Entitlement tab. So next up, we're going to cover adjusting your employees' payments to accommodate the statutory maternity pay. And as we look through this, we're going to look at two main methods. The first one's going to be using the Make Up Basic option, which is a handy way of automatically adjusting basic payments if there's a specific amount you want the employee to receive, for example, their full basic pay. And then we'll discuss briefly doing manual adjustments to the payments, which is where you do a calculation to work out what you want to pay them on top of their maternity pay. And that's usually in relation to the work that they've done in that period. So we're going to go back to the demo now. I'm already on my payroll tasks and I have my employee selected. Double check you've got the correct process date entered. So this should be the date the employee receives their pay, last day of the month in my example. And then if I go into the Enter Payment screen, it takes me onto the Payments tab. So currently I have the full salary entered, but checking the summary, we can see it's paying that full salary and it is also paying the statutory maternity pay, which is being paid as of the 19th of July. Now, let's first imagine that this employee has in their contract an entitlement to full pay for at least some of the maternity leave. So it might be known as contractual maternity pay, occupational maternity pay. And we want them to receive their usual £2,500 in total, made up of SMP and basic pay. So to do this, we can use the Make Up Basic option, which will do an automatic adjustment to the pre-tax payments. Now, first thing you'll need to do, particularly in subsequent months, once you've started doing this, is to enter the full amount you want them to receive. So I've already got the full salary entered, one at £2,500. And then to use Make Up Basic, return to the Summary tab and simply click the Make Up Basic button. Now you're then going to be prompted to make an adjustment, and this adjustment will be to the first payment in the list. So it's telling me it's going to need to adjust the hours or number value of salary to make up to basic. And for me, I would simply click yes to continue, and that will reduce the salary amount. Now, if you've got multiple payments and it's not the first one in the list that you want to adjust, you can click no to this message, and then it will ask you about the next payment in the list. And when it comes up with the one you do want to adjust, that is when you would click yes. But I'm going to click yes now, and you can see that automatically the pre-tax payments have reduced, leaving the employee with total gross pay of £2,500. That's their usual salary. And then looking at the payments tab, the adjustment has been done to the hours or number, which in turn has reduced the amount. So for any period where I want to give them full salary, in this case, all I would do is enter the full salary, go to the summary tab and click make up basic, and then it will adjust based on whatever the statutory payment is for that period. So that's make up basic. And as you can see, the deductions will be what they usually receive. So for pension, tax, national insurance, and this will be the net pay that they would normally get on their full pay. Now, if you don't have a company maternity scheme and you only want to pay SMP for the period the employee is on maternity leave, you will need to do a manual adjustment to the basic. So this month, they worked some of the month. They worked up to the 18th, and then they went on to maternity leave. So I would need to manually calculate what I want to pay the employee for those days that they worked. Now, quick caveat at this point, there are different methods that can be used to calculate a part period salary. So you would refer to the employee's contract to your company policy for confirmation on exactly how you should do it. But to give you an example, I'm going to adjust this salary by looking at the number of days the employee worked in the month and the total number of working days within that period. So I know that this employee has worked 14 days and there were 23 working days in July. So the way that I'm going to adjust the salary is I'm going to make an adjustment to the hours or number. I'm going to do 14 divided by 23. Now, that's just an example. That has now adjusted the salary down. And looking at the summary, the statutory maternity pay is being added to that amount. So the pay is a little bit lower than it would be because I haven't worked for the full period. And then from next month, I would end up reducing this salary to 0. And then the employee would just receive the SMP that's due. Now, if the employee is receiving less pay than usual, something that you do need to consider is the pension contributions. So in most cases, the employer contribution for employees on paid maternity leave must be maintained at the same level it was before the employee went on maternity leave. And this will often mean that you need to make an adjustment to the pension. And the best way to do that is to set it to a fixed amount for the period of the maternity leave. So for this employee, if I click on the employee button, this is actually going to take me into the employee record. It just means that I'm not interrupted my pay run. I can go onto the pensions tab just here at the top, and I can click onto manage schemes. I'm going to edit the pension scheme for this employee. And rather than just calculate 3% as the employer contribution, I'm going to temporarily set it to a fixed amount. And looking back on my reports, I know that the employer usually contributes £59.40. So that's going to be a fixed amount contribution for the period of that paid maternity leave. Now, for the employee, they're still going to put in 5% of their pensionable pay. And if you need any clarification on what your pension scheme rules are and how they should be handled over maternity leave, best people to ask about that would be the pension provider. So in this case, the employer's pension is now that fixed amount. They're getting slightly less pay this month. They're going to get a lot less next month if I don't have a company scheme, I'm not making up to basic because their salary will be reduced to 0. So just to finish off the pay run, I'm going to show you some of the pre-update reports. So I've just selected everyone for this bit of the demo, and looking at the pay slips to start with. And it'll be similar for whatever payslip format you use, whether that's online or email or printed. Statutory payments always have their own separate line. So statutory parental pay, in this case, is the 96431. And the salary that I manually reduced is showing just here. I'm still seeing the usual deductions. And remember that employer pension has now been changed to a fixed amount. And then obviously the net pay appears at the bottom of the screen. So statutory pay is shown as that separate figure. Payment summary reports have their own column for parental payments. So you'll find it on part 1, payment summary part 1. And you can see in this case, I just have the one parental payment this month for employee 1. Got the report total at the bottom. And once you've got all the reports that you need, you'd complete your pay run in the usual way. So updating the records, and then sending your full payment submission to HMRC, and that will report the usual taxable pay and deductions. So given a total liability figure, but this figure doesn't include the amount you're recovering. So this is what you would have to pay if there was no maternity pay being recovered. And you'll see later on, we're going to do an EPS submission, which reports the reduction in that liability. So you would send your FPS as normal. We've now completed that pay run. And at the end of the month, we can do our reclaim. So before we talk about that, just to recap, adjusting the employee's payments. One method might be to use Make Up Basic. So you would enter the full amount you want your employee to receive, go to the Summary tab and click the Make Up Basic option, and then you will be prompted to reduce your employee's pay. So that's an easy way you can do an automatic adjustment for those employees where you have a company maternity scheme. Or you can do manual adjustments. So work out what you want to pay the employee for that particular period based on what they've worked. Enter that on the Payments tab, and that will then be added to whatever the SMP happens to be. The other thing to consider is your pension adjustment. So usually employer contributions must be maintained at pre-maternity kind of rates. So you would do that by entering a fixed amount, and then you would type in the amount that you want to continue contributing. A little bit different with salary sacrifice, because technically with the salary sacrifice scheme, all of it is an employer contribution, but you can't reduce statutory pay as part of a salary sacrifice. So again, speak to your pension provider if you're unsure, and you would need to enter the necessary fixed amount employer contribution that you want to be recorded into the pension. So next up, let's just cover reclaiming statutory pay. So it's the same principle for any statutory parental payment. And when you get to the end of each month, 2 tasks you'll have. Number 1, run your P32 report, and that will calculate the amount that you're eligible to reclaim, either 92% as a standard employer or 108.5% if you qualify for small employers relief. And then you'll need to do an EPS submission. Now this is a monthly submission. Even if your payroll is weekly, wait until the end of the tax month to do this one, and then you'll be reporting the amount that you're able to reclaim for the tax year to date, so that HMRC can then establish what you need to pay. So let's take a look at those 2 steps now. So I've already completed all of my payroll for the current tax month. 31st of July was my monthly pay date. I've updated records and done an FPS. So let's take a look at the P32 report to start with, and I'm going to use the quick link again from the payroll tasks. Just going to run it for tax month 4. So that's the July tax month. So I've got 4 and 4 in the criteria values. And just scrolling in, you can see at item 6, I've got total SMP recovered. So as a small employer, that's 100% of what I paid out. And then we've got our NIC compensation, which is 8.5% of the SMP. Now, the way that I get this money back is I deduct it from the tax and the national insurance that I was due to pay over. So on my FPS, you saw the total liability was around £7,000. But looking at this report, the total amount due is less than that. And the reason for that is that I've recovered SMP. And also this month, I'm still claiming employment allowance. The employment allowance has been dealt with. We did a submission for that at the start of the year, but we do need to report the SMP reclaim values as part of an EPS. So that's what I need to pay. And when I'm ready to send the EPS, and keep in mind, you need to wait until the end of the tax month or at least the 20th of the calendar month before you send this. You can use the quick link for employer payment summary, or you can go to e-submissions and you can run it from here. And in the employer payment summary wizard, you just click this first option to say you're adjusting your payment because you can recover statutory payments. Click onto next and it will show you the tax month 4 in this case. Click next again and it shows you the total amounts recovered for the tax year to date. So this is the first time I've paid statutory pay this year. But when I do this next month, it will show me the cumulative value, the year-to-date value, because this is a year-to-date submission. CIS deduction suffered doesn't apply in this case. It can be entered manually here where required. And apprenticeship levy doesn't apply to this company either. So I'd complete the EPS wizard. It'll then take me into the submission, which looks something like this. So all you would do here is click continue and then submit. Click submit once more. And that is the EPS sent to HMRC. So they now know that I'm reclaiming statutory pay and they can adjust the amount that's due in my PAYE online account. So those are your month-end tasks, running the P32 report and then sending your EPS. So got about 5 minutes left, so I wanted to just briefly cover off some troubleshooting. And I'm going to start with something that is probably the top reason that our support team receive calls around SMP. And this is something that happens if an employee has received SMP before and the previous child's information has not been completely reset. Now, to give you some background on this, if an employee has received SMP before, the number of weeks of that statutory payment that has been paid previously is stored in the year-to-date values. And that is never reset at the start of a new tax year because very often SMP can span more than one tax year. So it keeps a kind of running total until the full entitlement has been paid. Now, it does mean that when you pay SMP for the next child, you will need some way of resetting that year-to-date value. Two ways you could do it. One way is to use the quick SMP screen, and you'll see a message that pops up telling you you've already paid SMP to this employee and do you want to record details for a second child? So if you're setting up, you'd click yes, and that would remove the previous information. Alternatively, you can manually reset the week's SMP paid in the employee's year-to-date values. So because it's quite a common one, I want to show you this one as a quick demo. So I'm just going to set my next pay date, which is going to be 31st of August. And I'm going to choose another employee who's starting maternity leave. Now, we're going to look at the maternity details in the employee record. So if I go to absence and then SMP, I can see there are some existing details from 2017. And what this means is if I check the year-to-date value from employment, YTD values, and then statutory payments, we still have 39 weeks recorded as a year-to-date. Now, the problem this causes is if you just overwrite that information or the maternity details with the new dates, and you don't reset this value, it doesn't calculate the SMP. So 2 ways you can fix it. You could just manually set that value to 0 and then go back to SMP details and then delete and re-enter the new dates. Or another way you can do it is to use the recording maternity link, and then it pops up with this message. Now, be a bit careful with this message, because if you're in the middle of paying SMP, the last thing you want to do is to remove the details. So if you're ever unsure, always click no to this message, and that will show you what information is stored. So I know this is old information and I need to clear it. So if I go into recording maternity again, I can click yes, and I can go ahead and I can start entering the details. So I've got some dates there for the next child. I've just entered them that way. And if I check the year-to-date values, you can see that it has completely cleared the 39 weeks that was previously stored. So just one to watch out for employees that received it before, and a couple of ways you can get around that. So that's the main reason that no SMP might calculate. Other reasons could be that average earnings are too low. So have a look in the quick SMP screen to check those average earnings. And if it's less than £125, they don't qualify. You'd give them an SMP1 form. Another reason why it might not show is that you've got manual statutory pay calculations selected. So you will be alerted if you use the quick SMP screen, if that is the case. Or you could always check in the employee record, absence and SMP. You just need to clear the manual statutory pay calculation checkbox. The other type of query we get is when SMP is a bit more or less than what you're expecting. So first thing to check here when you're troubleshooting is, have you entered the correct process date? So is it the next date your employees are being paid? And then something to keep in mind, particularly for the first and last payment of SMP, is that it is calculated up to the process date. So if, for example, you pay on the 25th of the month, and usually you'd pay the salary up to the end of the month, SMP payments would be slightly lower in the first month because they're only being calculated to the 25th, but that will right itself at the end of the maternity leave because they would then receive kind of the end of the previous month along with their final payment. And if it's specifically the standard rate of SMP that you think is too low, do keep in mind that the standard rate is either the flat rate, 187.18 per week, or 90% of average weekly earnings, whichever's lower. So that catches a few people out sometimes for the standard rate. But hopefully those troubleshooting tips would help, and that's actually brought us to the end of what we're going to cover in the webinar. We will stick around another 5 minutes or so just to make sure we've answered your questions. Quick look at some of the further support available. So these were the webinars we're running in July. We do have recordings of some of the earlier ones, but coming up, we've got our Sage HR showcase for core HR this Thursday and the following Wednesday. Get Your Payroll Done month end is another live one, and we've just scheduled some sessions for August as well. So you can get yourself signed up at sage.co.uk/webinars. Other places you can get support include our help centre. So click any of the help options in Sage 50 Payroll or head to sage.co.uk/help. And if you do need to contact our support team, if you go to the help centre first, choose the topic you need help with, and then follow the get in touch link, that will give you the best way of contacting our team with that type of query. And a quick mention of Sage University, you can access it at sageu.com. This is the home of our e-learning courses, certification and bite-sized learning. Plenty to get stuck into on Sage U. So create your profile and see what's available. So as we start to wrap up, we will continue answering the questions in the Q&A. If you'd like a copy of the handout, don't forget to download those before you go. I will send you a follow-up email later today with a link to the recording of today's session. So look out for that in about an hour's time. And as you leave the webinar, we'll invite you to take our survey. So it'd be great to know what you thought of the session today, whether you found it useful, or perhaps you have suggestions for improvements. If you could take a moment to complete the survey as you leave, we read all of your comments and we try to use it to improve our sessions moving forward. So I am going to go on to mute briefly just to help out with any remaining questions. We'll keep the webinar open a few more minutes to give you a chance to look through the Q&A. But for now, I'm going to say goodbye, and I'll come back to you when we're ready to close the webinar down. So I'll speak to you soon. Hi again, everyone, and thank you so much for sending the questions through. We're just going to get the last few answers out to a couple of that have just dropped in. But I just thought I'd pop back to thank you all once again for joining us at the webinar. I hope you found this one useful, and we do look forward to seeing you on some of our other webinars in the future. If you wouldn't mind completing the survey as you leave, that would be great, and look out for that follow-up email arriving later today. But from myself, Alice and Lee, thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you on the next one. Goodbye.